Okay, we're going to look at how you can output to a standard rubric in Ultramarker. Now this is an example of a standard sort of rubric in a table format in a word process document. So we've got our grades. Now obviously if we've got a large number of grades, if we've got say 12 grades or more grades in our grading schema, then we have to group them together. So I've grouped them together by saying that I've grouped the A grades together, the B grades, C grades, D grades and F grades. And they're in these 5 columns here. We also have criteria. So I've got 3 criteria in here. Introduction, discussion and recommendations. And I've got a description of what we're expecting, the standards expected for each of those grade groups, for each of those criterion. So obviously if the introduction is poor, then it's going to be in the sort of the fail grade. If it's excellent, it's going to be the A grade, and so on. So that's a standard sort of rubric that we see in education. Now, how can we output to that rubric? Now, I've got an example of a template here. So this is an unpopulated rubric with variables, with unpopulated variables. So we've got our unit title, assessment number, student name. We've got our grade groups along the top here in this row here in our 5 columns. We've got our 3 criteria, and then we've got our criteria for each grade. Okay, the variables representing that, and we've got our mark for each of those criteria, and we've got our overall grade. So I want to be able to output in that format. So when I normally, I've got the same assessment here with introduction, discussion and recommendations. So those are my three criterion in my assessment. Now and those are my grades. So I've got a number of grades, so I have to group them together. So I'm going to group those grades. Now when I normally mark an assessment, if I go from edit criteria mode into marking mode, and obviously I allocate a mark to each of my criterion for that student, and then I save the work for that student, and it gives me an overall assessment mark. I can also output in a report format, but supposing I don't want that report format and I just want to output in a rubric format. Well, what I can do is if I go to settings and I switch on show gen assess, which is short for show generate assessment, and when I switch from edit criteria mode, I go to gen assess mode. Now I need to load this rubric file. This is the file that I've got here. I need to load that, so I'm going to close that because I don't want that to be open when I load it. So I can actually pull that in. So I'm loading the right rubric. The other thing I need to do is to group my grades together. So I've got A1 and A4 representing the boundaries of my A grades, B1 to B3 for my B grades, C1 to C3, D1 to D3, and for my F grades it's F1 to F3. So those are my grade groups, as it were. Now the other thing I probably want to do is to select whether, when I'm marking the student, whether I want to represent the box in which I've ticked as a tick, or I can also highlight it, just highlight it. I can put a tick in the highlight in there. I can tick, highlight and bold the text. I'll just put a tick in there. So when I've marked this student, as you can see here. I can also add comments there as well, and I can output comments to the rubric as well, but I won't do that in this case. So I will switch back to Gen Assess mode, and I'm ready to hit generate. So when I hit generate, it will start to generate that output rubric in that format. You can see it's already put a tick in the relevant box. I've just chosen to put the grades the other way round to my rubric there. So I'll save that and I'll close that down. Now when I go into my file here, when I look at that and I open that up, you'll see that it's output those marks in a standard rubric. So my student can see they've got a tick in that box, tick in that box, tick in this box, and they've also got some feedback, and hopefully they'll have an overall grade as well. So that's how it works with using output. Fairly straightforward in Ultramarker. What you have to remember is you don't want to have too many criteria, otherwise it's going to go over to several sheets. Okay, several sheets of A4 in your when you look at your rubric. The other thing is you can't have too many grades or groups, because if you have more than, say, 6 or 7, it starts to go off the sheet, off the edge of the sheet, and you're going to struggle to fit your text into there. You're going to have to start reducing text size, and it starts to look very untidy. It's the same as any rubric. You wouldn't have too many criteria in a rubric, and you wouldn't have too many of these grades on a rubric either, so you have to group them together. The other thing is you can't have sub-criteria, because normally you wouldn't have this hierarchical structure on a, normally a rubric is a single level, so you've only got one level of criteria. So that's just one thing to remember there. But of course a lot of people prefer to output to a rubric, and that's what perhaps some people prefer to see. The other thing you can do conversely, instead of using this to mark students, you can also design your assessment. So I could have actually used Ultramarker to design my assessment by adding my criteria. Okay, and once I've done that, so I've put all of my criteria to achieve the grades in there. I've put my full description of the requirements for each of my grades. So I've gone into edit criteria mode, and I've gone in here and edited my assessment. And so I've put in my 3 criteria, or several criteria, and I put in my description of the criteria requirements for each of those criterion, and then I've put in the criteria to achieve each grade. I'd need to remember to use the same for each of my each grade though, for each of my grade groups, okay, because it's going out to a standard rubric, remember, so that should say the same thing between A1 and A4, okay. Then when I'm ready to output that, I can then go to my Gen Assess mode, and I can actually switch off. I can just switch off no tick, no highlight, no bold or anything. Instead of a student, it will output to the standard rubric. Now obviously we can then remove from that document. So if I go back into here again and look at that rubric, if we open that up, if I remove the student's name here, okay, and I remove this from here, obviously what I can then do is I'm just outputting to a standard rubric. So let me just do that. Remove the student name there, and I'll save this again to a different file name. So I need to make sure that I select that new rubric, and then when I generate this and save it, I'm going to save it as a different file name because this is not the student's name. I'll just call it rubric 1 or something. So we'll save that. And when we open that, we see that we've got the output, we've got our standard rubric. Okay, so we've generated a rubric using Ultramarker. So that's the technique. You can output mark student work and output to a rubric, or you can actually produce an assessment within Ultramarker, and then you can output it and produce a standard rubric from within Ultramarker. So there are 2 techniques that you can use.